um, take a moment to say that I'm seeing the subscription numbers going up. I am incredibly happy that we are having this discussion and that this membership site is live now. There's information in the description below if you're interested in the membership site. So, minor technical issue, I'm getting a little feedback. So, we'll continue though. Let's see. Um, right. So, risk tolerances. So, here it is. You have your compliance manual, and you are trying your best to make sure that you have a comprehensive document that addresses a number of things. And before I do anything further, let me just make sure that my mic is not giving me too much of a feedback issue. Right. This is what happens on live. You tend to have some technical difficulties at times. So, not a problem. Right. Not quite. So, you're going to see some technical support. Come. Never mind, it's a live. This is what happens during a live. So, this is Christoph. Christoph is helping in the background with some of the technical support, and I'm getting a little feedback. So, I'm wanting to make sure that the audio actually is qualitative and it doesn't hurt you. All right, great. So, where was I? So, compliance manuals, chasing compliance, the membership, the sea of regulation, two separate things. Now, the Sea of Regulation is a YouTube channel that I created to put out content in relation to compliance issues that I think need to be discussed and could provide some insight to persons. And if you've not subscribed to my channel and this is the first time you're coming across anything that I've done, I would encourage you to subscribe because there's a lot of content that is out now for a couple of months, and I'm definitely going to keep the content coming. The lives are going to be done at least once to twice a month, and it is designed to help have a broader discussion with compliance professionals who might not be able to join the membership. And the membership site, Chasing Compliance, the details to join are in the description of this video, actually will go into depth in terms of a number of compliance issues. So every month we will be there multiple times per month, and there will be non-public content. So I wanted to make sure I reach the broadest spectrum of persons now and in the future. So I don't know when you're going to be watching this. And this is part of why I am doing it. As a regulator, I am often in the position of administering the test. And there have been a lot of things that I've seen where I can't exactly say, you shouldn't do it like that, or I would do it this way. And while I've already done my disclaimer in terms of this is not advice, some of the things you might find helpful, you might be able to reflect on it and go forward from there to probably have a better compliance outcome. So with that being said, let's just jump into some of the things that I think are essential for your review and development of your compliance manual. Now, in terms of development, you could be brand new or it could be a brand new organization, hence the term development. But a lot of the concepts would apply even if it's an existing organization and you have need to update an existing document. Of course, some of the things that I will discuss where I think it applies better to one or the other will be self-evident, or I'll set it out based on my interpretation. So there are some prerequisites that need to be addressed in relation to your preparation to develop and review a compliance manual. And the first thing in terms of the prerequisites, so this is even before you get to step one, is to have a firm understanding of the risk tolerance of the board and the firm. And so there should be some statements setting out what risks the firm is prepared to take versus not prepared to take. And why is this important? What I've seen in my career is that sometimes the actual risk tolerance that the board understands deviates from what is captured in the risk assessment framework. And so the risk assessment framework gets into more detail, but that risk tolerance statement is incredibly helpful for you as a compliance officer to make a determination as to how you're going to approach AML CFT measures. Now, the next thing that would be relevant for existing forms and not a new form is any inspection reports or internal audits that were conducted and the reports produced from those inspections and or internal audits. And you could have both in relation to a form that has been in existence, even if just for a year or two. And why is that important? If it is that you've been inspected by the regulator would have certain recommendations and corrective actions to put in place, and that can definitely impact the compliance manual. Similarly, the internal audit would produce a report in terms of gaps against the actual practices in the firm or procedures, and it's dependent on how that internal audit has been scoped. But certainly, from what I've seen, internal audits provide useful data and information for compliance professionals to make informed decisions. So what else is there? If it's an existing firm, you will have existing policies as well that might not be in the existing compliance manual. You'll need to have a review of those to determine whether there's a need to augment the compliance manual as it exists. And then there's a last point that some of you might not have done and may not have considered. And it's something that I've borrowed from another avenue of work in regulation. And that's in relation to developing systems and changing protocols for better outcomes in regulation and for monitoring enforcement issues or market conduct issues. And that is to develop and obtain business requirements. Now, it's not for the compliance professional to actually develop the business requirements. The business requirements help you to map how the processes actually flow within the firm, regardless as to whether it's a new firm or an existing firm. A lot of times processes evolve over time. And what was typically done maybe 2 years ago, someone took out 2 steps and there's no a shortcut. And that is the actual practice. But the process requirements, the business requirements actually is not in line with what is being done. And so refreshing those business requirements are actually quite useful for developing the compliance manual. And from what I've seen is that you can identify just from the process flow in terms of who gets what, who assesses what, who may need to sign off on certain things, where decisions need to be made. And of course, people who are familiar with project management are familiar with the symbols that are used, a perpendicular, triangle for some kind of decision, or a box that is on its side in a diamond shape. Has a particular meaning. But for you as a compliance professional, you are not the one that's developing those business requirements. It's the people that are doing the job. And this is where I think that synergies need to happen between compliance and operations. You have a lot of disconnect because compliance might not really be integrated with operations, and actually engaging senior management within the firm to get those business requirements and really interrogate them would assist you in the beginning phases of developing your compliance manual or reviewing it. Excuse me. So mapping the business requirements for AML, CFT, and other compliance provisions is essential. Now that we've looked at the prerequisites, let's go straight to what I would deem as step one for your review and development of compliance manuals. The first thing that you need to do is determine the source documents that you need to use. And what do I mean by source documents? Well, regardless as to what field you're in, there's a law that applies to you. So the first thing you need to look at is the statutes, the regulations, the codes, guidance, different documents that have force of law should form a part of your source documents. What else would be required? There may be guidance that is issued by the regulator or another relevant competent authority that is equally important. And in some cases, regulators will actually put out guidance in terms of what minimum provisions should be captured in your compliance manual. And I've seen that in a multitude of jurisdictions. From this side of the planet where I'm on to the other side of the planet, regulators are typically very good in terms of providing guidance in terms of what should be captured in a compliance manual. What should also be covered, and I don't often see in some industries are better than others, is referencing your typologies reports. Now, FATF produces typology reports on almost every, I think they've done it for every sector now, and they update them every so often. But what happens is that firms don't necessarily give regard to that. Now, if you've been subject to an inspection, the regulator may have incorporated those typologies into the laws, and it may be that you are covered already because your regulations have been adopted and updated to reflect those particular typologies. But in a number of cases, there's a bit of a lag. So it's important to keep up to date with what is issued by the relevant international standard setters. And I've named FATF in relation to AML CFT, but of course there are others. I did a video in terms of who are the international standard setters for different sectors. If you're not familiar as a compliance officer, please go and visit my channel to see that particular video so you know who are the international standard setters relevant to your industry, because it's going to be relevant for another point I'll make below. Now, once you've supplemented your review and your source documents in step one with all of those things, typologies, laws, guidance, any other publication from any other competent authority, there may be some statements that you need to give regard to. You should also be looking at the sanctions that are in place or that impact your particular business and your particular jurisdiction. You should definitely integrate those. But you may also want to consider what are the best practices. So certain industry associations may put out information in relation to best practices in a particular jurisdiction. And if that has been done, it may also be relevant to capture that within your manual with the appropriate caveats. No, and that particular provision in relation to any other best practice, again, is something that would dovetail with the risk tolerance that I've set out before that would be provided by the board in a statement or in some other format. Now, that is step one, which is to determine your source information to help you develop your compliance manual. Step two is in relation to how to put all of those pieces together. And essentially, it boils down to creating a matrix or matrices. And there might be benefit to you in creating either one comprehensive matrix or actually having two or more matrices separate, but having your links. Now, Excel and different database type applications have a lot of utility that help you to link certain things, but the sort feature will become quite relevant. And in the membership, we're actually going to drill down in some of the headers and the data points that could be captured in relation to matrices that would work. And I think that it is definitely something that helps you visualize and organize yourself in terms of that source data and what you want to accomplish. Now, in relation to how you as a compliance professional will look at the matrix, you would want to make sure that you have a number of things that set out AML CFT provisions as well as prudential and other statutory provisions. And that is important. Why? Because in prudential requirements, you will have certain things that would require you to file or notify your regulator or other competent authorities in relation to particular activities. And again, prudential, it could cover a whole host of things: prior approval, capital requirements, liquidity requirements. There could be notification requirements for certain trigger events. And all of those things should be covered in your compliance manual. I think it's really important to make sure that you have fuller coverage in relation to that. It is one of the things that I've seen as a regulator that compliance manuals can go really overboard and I do mean overboard in relation to AML CFT to kind of check all the boxes, even though it's risk based and it's not a checkbox approach. You look at that guidance that the regulator has issued and you want to make sure you hit everything, but at the end of the long day, it is missing the mark a bit. So that is important to make sure that you have it identified in your process where you create your matrix. Now, what else would be in the matrix? And it's no coincidence that I am a red pill girl as it relates to the other matrix. But for the AML CFT provisions, you have to tie in your risk assessment framework. Now, the discussion on the risk assessment framework will be a separate topic altogether. Um, there's a few variables in relation to a risk assessment framework that I have comments on. And I know that a lot of people use high, medium, and low. And I absolutely think that that doesn't help you really risk assess and risk score and address your mind to your limited resources to your clients or accounts or whatever it is your business has. I prefer four-tiered risk assessments. You have high, medium, low, so that you know which side of the fence your risk is leaning on, and you would be able to apply more scrutiny to the areas that are important or more risky. And with that, you are also able to apply simplified customer due diligence or simplified KYC for your clients and your business if it is that the business and the typologies would allow for that. And I think that in terms of simplified due diligence for low risk clients, it is something that is really underused. So consider whether you should include those provisions. I think that it helps you to really address your mind to it. One of the last things that I would want to say in relation to creating the matrix is consideration of dual purpose goods. Now, with dual purpose goods, that's proliferation financing territory. And a lot of manuals miss this. Now, you may have a firm that I'll use the trust and corporate services providers that provide structures and companies and trusts and what have you for your client base. And you may have clients who are doctors or in biochemical industries or other medical practices. And in the current global circumstances, it's an area that is getting a lot of attention. But depending on the field of medicine that your client or that particular company may be in, the source material that is needed or some of the inventory needed for that particular business could be a dual purpose good. Now, what controls do you have in place in relation to knowing whether your clients are going to be using dual purpose goods or not? Because there's transshipment requirements, there are requirements for safeguarding them, and it's just for in terms of awareness as it relates to your risk assessment. Because you might think, okay, doctor with a medical practice, that's medium risk, which is the nice pool we like to lump everything in, but not recognizing that this is an oncologist and they're going to be using certain radioactive material to do radiation therapy or whatever other therapies, and it could be used for other purposes, or they're in agriculture and certain fertilizers can be used to make certain other things. So not getting into the science of it, but just in terms of the awareness that is necessary for you as a compliance professional in developing that compliance manual to be absolutely comprehensive to what you do and the business of the firm. Now, the third step, this is the meaty step, which is the actual development and review of the compliance manual. Again, if the firm is brand new, this would be development. And you would have a number of things that you would have to consider in terms of developing that manual. And in most cases, if the firm is brand new, you would be coming in with a compliance manual before being approved or licensed by your regulatory authority. So it could be that you already have a document and no business as yet because this was one of the requirements for you to be licensed. And that happens in a number of jurisdictions. You just can't pop up and then figure out compliance afterwards. It is one of the conditions in relation to actually getting a license. And so one of the things that I would say in this development stage is the business requirements that I spoke about in the prior step that you would obtain from senior management. You need to get those again and apply a bit of design thinking to it to make sure that you understand how the process flows and then try to break it. And I quite like trying to break things. And this is basically to interrogate the process to make sure that it doesn't have any weak points, that some bad actor can come in and basically usurp the system and execute something, just if they want to launder money and they know that these are the steps, then they might know how to disguise a particular transaction or know what to disclose or how to disclose or whom to disclose something to. All of those things are important for you to consider in your thinking of the control measures that you're going to put in place to prevent money laundering and to ensure compliance with statutory requirements. So these are some of the things that I think that you should be thinking about when you are looking at the business requirements. You can try to break it, or you can get somebody else who didn't write it to try and break it. So if it is that you have the business requirements provided by a senior manager, get somebody who's on the front line, who's actually doing the work to tell you what happens and see whether it matches up. And that's another way to reconcile whether you might have a problem or not. But I think that is one option. You might also want to consider using mystery shoppers to test those same processes and business requirements. So the business requirements basically just map out the process, test the processes, and make sure that they actually work and try to break them. This is like being a white hat hacker. You're trying to find the chinks in the armor before you actually deploy it and implement something that potentially might not work, and you don't want that. So what else would I suggest? Remember that internal audit, if it was done, that might be acting as a gap analysis. So you could use that as well to determine what you might need to do or consider in your development of your compliance manual. Now, another thing that I've seen in relation to compliance manuals when they're updated is that you've tried your best to make sure that you capture everything, but you're in the process of updating and laws change and you miss something. So while you're updating, even though it was step one in terms of source documents, have a recheck. Have there been any amendments that you missed? Make sure that you are very clear. Compliance associations are great in relation to this. And it definitely helps when compliance professionals and the wider industry is a part of the consultation process when there's new legislation being proposed, that you actually know what's coming on stream before it comes on stream, and that aids in your development of a timely document. Now, the table of contents. I can give some headers. These are in no particular order. But what I will tell you is that most compliance professionals are pretty good in relation to having a comprehensive table of contents. And again, that guidance document that may be provided by your regulator tends to help quite often in relation to that. In the table of contents, I've seen things like, this is important, definitions. Definitions are important because I've seen manuals that define things according to how they want them and not what is in accordance with law. And that is a problem. So definitions is definitely one of those things that you need to scrutinize to make sure that your definitions line up. Creating your own terminology is sometimes a dangerous exercise, and it can get you into trouble later down, or at least, have some kind of legal battle on your hands, not necessarily with the regulator either. It could be with a client at the end of the day if something comes to light and they are really interrogating what you've done and how you've applied it. So that's a knife that can cut both ways. I've also seen the business overview and applicable laws are important. So again, the source information, what laws are relevant. But one of the things that I think is missed from some manuals that's really important is the purpose of the manual. That is missing in some cases. And I think globally, it's one of the things that it has now gotten better, but in discussions with some professionals, regulatory professionals from around the world, it's one of those areas that I guess could be tightened up. Sometimes there are generic statements that, and then again, the association can cut both ways. It can be good, it can be bad. An association has put together some things that they would want to consider, and they say, use this generic blanket statement if you're in X sector. And what tends to happen is that sometimes that purpose of the manual thing doesn't necessarily work because your business is a bit more nuanced. So it's important to actually look at the purpose of the manual against your business overview and make sure it matches so that it's not just a boilerplate provision. We want to get away from boilerplates in financial services. What else have I seen? I've seen risk statements, consequences for compliance failures. I have seen record keeping and record retention. That is very important in every jurisdiction. That is actually pinned into FATF recommendations. I've seen the role of the compliance officer, the role of the MLRO, which is the money laundering reporting officer. And I think it's important to set out those roles because they each have unique functions. And while the compliance officer is the individual to whom the board has delegated the compliance function to, the manual should also set out that the compliance function is the responsibility of the board of directors. It is not something where you just put the compliance professional out on a line to dry or leave them to the cruel realities of life. At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the board. And if you are a compliance professional, make sure that that kind of message is clear. If you have a really good compliance culture, it would not be a problem. In some other cases, it sometimes is ticklish. So that is one of the things that you need to look out for. But the role of the compliance officer is important. And the compliance officer should not have a slash career. They shouldn't be compliance officer slash this person, compliance officer slash that person. And in smaller firms, it's fine for the compliance officer to also be the MLRO. But once you hit a certain critical mass, that is probably not a good idea. I've also seen the compliance manual address advertising, prudential filing requirements. So those filings that you are required to make to your regulator or other competent authorities. It also should set out what should be notified. And in some compliance manuals, I've seen them provide lead time in relation to certain activities. So if you're going to do X, if you're going to apply for a senior officer, someone to be promoted to a senior officer with a particular function, it may be separate from the operational manual for the main business, but it may be an addendum for management in terms of what they need to do to make sure that they don't contravene a provision by appointing someone without seeking prior approval where it's required. No, I spoke about business requirements earlier, and I spoke about senior managers. Those senior managers also need to include the HR manager or director. And why is that? Because sometimes there's a disconnect when people are hired into a firm that falls in scope of regulatory approval, and then oops, you have a contravention, the regulator is not impressed. And you want to make sure that the provisions capture all of these things, including your KYE. So you have existing staff, and I have a YouTube video in relation to KYE. why you might have a risk within if you don't have compliance measures to monitor certain things. Again, that might be an addendum that's just there for senior management, but it's important to have a very robust compliance framework because you don't know where the risks could present themselves. And in a number of cases where money launderers have been and other people perpetrating financial crimes have been tremendously successful, it's in relation to those that had someone helping them either knowingly in the inside or they were negligent. And those business requirements where I was talking about trying to find the gaps in, try and break it, try and find those gaps and the employees that might be weak. So there's a lot to be done in relation to that. In your compliance manual, and some people have it as a separate document, but to me it's important to have proper sanctions coverage in your compliance manual. And why is that? You have the employee declaration that also, or you call it affirmation, they're different names, but the employee basically affirming that they've read and they will comply and that there could be consequences for them acting outside of the compliance provisions. It's important to make sure that sanctions have very good coverage on your compliance manual. You should also have what you should be reporting to the compliance, your reporting authority and your competent authority. I think I may have mentioned that. You should have in there how to file a suspicious transaction report or suspicious activity report. And it's important and the steps to take to actually get there. And why it's important, some people don't really do anything until you have a problem. And then there's defensive filing, which doesn't necessarily help. So exercises in relation to how to file a suspicious transaction report could also help you in the development of the compliance manual. Because it's one thing to put in the procedures, but it's another thing if people don't know how to actually make a good filing. Now, complaints, advertising, I think I might have mentioned that before. Internal controls should also be captured, and responding to competent authorities. So not reporting, but responding, because your competent authority may make inquiries of you, and that could include the regulator, it could include your financial investigations unit, it could include your tax authority. And I think it's important to say that because a number of jurisdictions that I'm familiar with are branded as tax havens, and we are not. And there's a lot of misinformation in relation to who uses companies and why they use companies in certain jurisdictions, and it's not to necessarily hide money. Sometimes you can hide it in plain sight in a G20 country, much easier, and it's definitely easier to hide money, in my opinion, in a country where you have bank balances of trillions of dollars versus $1 or $2 billion. A couple $100 million showing up in these jurisdictions would definitely be noticed and immediately seized by authorities. So there's a lot that's being done there. But in relation to responding to competent authorities, you should also have protocols in terms of what should be required and what should happen in relation to when the regulator or another competent authority comes knocking. And it may be that a regulator is beginning to engage in close and continuous supervision. So they may start to communicate with additional persons in the firm, not necessarily a director, a senior manager, or compliance officer. And it's nothing in terms of there being a problem. It could be that you have someone, it could even be the receptionist or office manager who has communicated to the regulator that we've sent this package to you or something like that. But how is the firm's response to a competent authority being viewed? Is there a particular way to deal with that? And is that addressed in the manual or in an addendum to the manual? It may seem unimportant, but it's interesting when you have different levels of staff that then would have need to communicate with the regulatory authority or another competent authority, and there could be problems there if it's not well managed. So I would just suggest to make sure that you have something in relation to that. Now, when you identify that there are changes that are necessary to an existing manual, and so this is not for a new form, you would want to make sure that you keep a note of those things that have been changed to put in your notes and make sure that you have that for future training. Because the manual is not finished yet. You're still developing and you are still reviewing. But make a note of what has changed and what you need to train on before you finish the review. Now, there may be certain instances that from your review, you realize that, what the French toast, I need to train urgently on a particular issue. What should you do as a compliance professional? This is my opinion again. What I think you need to do in that particular scenario, if it were me, I would immediately engage with the board and let them know with a quick memo or report, something very short, very concise, that this is an urgent need, this is what I've seen, this is the area, these are the timelines, this is why I think it should be done. I need your approval to go ahead and do this even before I finish with the review of the compliance manual. And it could be that you have a very real threat present. And this is something that may have been done during 2020 when we went into different lockdowns with certain exposures, with staff working remotely. There are different scenarios that were popping up that may not have popped up before. You might have had to look at a number of different things, but it could pop up for a different number of reasons. So if you have that particular issue pop up that you recognize that there's a need for urgent training, remember the compliance function is the responsibility of the board. Get the board to decide on that so you have the green light. And remember, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Make sure you have documentation of that, whether it's a resolution from the board, an extract or something, so that you have your green light to go with that particular training. But if it's not urgent, of course, you're making your notes and we can then move on to step 4. Now, step 4 is in relation to finalizing the manual, and that's definitely not the last step. It's not even the penultimate step. But finalizing the draft manual has a few steps of its own. And if you have time, consider having somebody assess your advanced draft of that manual. If you have time. So if you have resources, whether legal or external or consultant, consider that as a part of the process. And if time permits, do that. If it doesn't permit or your resources, you might not have the ability to reach out to another person because it's a very agile firm, as I like to call them, so smaller footprint. Remember that we did the matrix. Map back your final document to the matrix or matrices that you've prepared to make sure that you haven't missed anything. And it serves as a bit of a check. And that matrix that we're going to talk about more in the actual membership is going to help you to review your own work objectively to make sure you've checked all the boxes. And in this particular case, checking the boxes to make sure you've covered everything is a good thing. And you want that comprehensive manual. So that is definitely showing you why it's important to do your homework and do your work thoroughly in step 1. I'm glad you're finding this informative. So definitely, if you have any questions or comments, drop it in the comments below. This is a live, but even after this is ended, keep your comments coming because I do check back on my comments. I'm a lot going on right now with the membership, so it may take me a day or two, but I try to be very good in relation to responding to comments. But information on the membership that I've mentioned, if you're joining halfway in, it's in the description below. So I would definitely encourage you to review that. And join. If you're a compliance professional in financial services, jump on in. It's going to be, I think, an amazing experience. Now, we're still finalizing the advanced draft of your report. you need to submit it back to the people who are responsible for compliance. And that is your board. And what you need to do is submit that, make sure that it has some sort of covering note, memo or something that gives, the highlights, what has changed. And this is in relation to update of an existing manual. What has changed? What are the key things that you want them to note? So one of the key things that you might want to draw their attention to is that, oh, by the way, the authorities in this particular jurisdiction have increased penalties for contraventions in relation to this particular AML failure from $250,000 in whatever currency to $2 million, as well as add fines in relation to the board of directors. That is something that I think they would be interested in knowing. But your covering memo should set out those high level points. Remember, board members are busy people. So you need to make sure that you effectively communicate that in concise manner. You don't need lots of words. You just need to make sure that you get the message across in terms of what is important, what you need to draw their attention to, so that they can immediately go to that. And then what decision are you seeking? You need to seek approval for that manual to go to the next step. And again, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Get your board resolution or extract, something expedited. Your board should have a secretary or a board member acting as secretary that records those corporate records, and make sure you get that for your contemporaneous notes to evidence that you have had board sign off. Now, once you get that board sign off, you need to update the version. Versioning is something that I see missed in a lot of compliance manuals that I've reviewed. And in fact, as a regulator, sometimes we might kick back a manual because we've seen something deficient, whether through an inspection or otherwise. And then we get a manual and it's like, when was this updated? When did the board approve it? So those are things that should be captured as well, especially for the documents that you are going to be filing to your regulator. Make sure you have your versioning, make sure you have the date of board approval, because it's going to be important in another step. What else is there that you should consider? So you have your minutes, you have any points from the board, and it could be that the board actually updates the manual too. No, this may be of a bit of controversy. You may have board members that want to edit the manual that you've produced, and the edit may be to remove certain provisions. What I would say to that is, if you think it is something material, set out your objections. If you have objections to that, make sure you're very clear. They may say, yes, I got it, but this is the direction I want to take. You make a note of it. Remember, document it. You've had this discussion, so and so and so. You keep your own contemporaneous notes in relation to that. It is not necessarily for compliance professionals to get into a fight with board members. You are the person to which compliance has been delegated to. You are not running the firm. And I think that that's another mistake that sometimes compliance professionals make. They get into it with their senior managers, and I need to plug in. Forgot that. So we're going to plug in this laptop before it dies. But yes, sometimes compliance professionals get into it with the board of directors, and that is definitely not your role. So you want to make sure you document and ensure that that is something that you discharge your responsibility on and take away really quickly. And again, we're live. These are the fun things that happen, especially when you're running a little late. I had a little issue, but I definitely wanted to start on time, and I did not want to have anyone waiting on the live for me. So I'm plugging this in right now. That's active risk management, people. Active risk management. So we're going to talk more in depth about some of these issues in the membership. I am so excited about the membership. And if you can't afford to join the membership, we're still open for the founding members at the lowest price that we are going to have it at. And if you cannot join us on the membership, I'm going to commit to doing these lives so that it helps everyone who might not be able to join. And I do hope you're able to join in the future. But let me jump into the next step, which is step 5, and it is distribution. So for distribution of that compliance manual, so you've received your approvals, you've had any revisions, you've tightened it up, you have your versioning, you have your dates. Who do you distribute this to? This could be a trick question. Now, some people will immediately say, well, file it with the regulator or file it with the reporting authority. And that might not necessarily be the correct answer. In some jurisdictions, it is a requirement that every time you update, you have to file it. In other jurisdictions, they may have a compliance reporting provision, whether semi-annual declaration from the compliance officer, and you would disclose whether you've updated your manual or not in the period that that particular report captures. And if yes, then it is for that authority to ask for the compliance manual. This is an area where spontaneous filing might not necessarily be okay. So it's definitely jurisdiction specific. And if you're curious, sometimes that same guidance document that was produced by the regulator may set out what is required, or in a code or other particular statute. But if you've done your matrix properly, you will know exactly what is required in relation to that. So who else do you distribute it to? You may need to distribute it to the reporting authority or an extract, especially as it relates to certain due diligence provisions, as well as certain filing provisions as it relates to suspicious transaction reports and suspicious activity reports. So make sure you're clear on that. And then let's level it down. You may want to distribute this to staff. So if regulatory approval or endorsement is not required in your jurisdiction, then the next level is definitely to distribute this to staff. And you would want to also have a firm timeline for you to obtain employee affirmations or declarations or whatever the terminology is in a timely manner and in a way that you can log that in your compliance records, because you will need to confirm that all of the staff have affirmed that they are going to comply with the procedures and that they understand that there are consequences for not complying, including and those are appropriately disclosed within the affirmation or the declaration that is provided to them. Log each one. Make sure that you reconcile. If you have 10 staff, you should have 10 declarations. And it is a curious question that I sometimes get in relation to whether the compliance officer themselves should sign their own declaration. And that is something that I'll discuss in the membership. Just a bit of a tease there in terms of what type of hot topics we tend to discuss. And I mean, it might seem like a small thing, but it is something that I think is worth considering. Training. So the last step in relation to developing your compliance manual, to my mind, and for the purposes of this particular live, is training. Now, I could probably expand 2 more steps, but I am conscious of the time and I don't want this to be overly long. I'm glad that people are finding it helpful, but the last step is training. So what you would need to do is definitely schedule training based on the provisions within the manual and within law. So the manual should reflect what is in your law. And in many jurisdictions, there's a requirement for annual training. But you may be doing something like refresher training, because if you've updated a manual and you have no changes to staff, then you would want to update that training to address what has changed or what risks you've seen or what you've amended in relation to the business requirements and those particular areas that you've seen potential risks, heightened risks. You might apply new measures, and so you would want to train in relation to that. In some jurisdictions, you have a time frame in which to train new staff. And with any manual update, you should be considering updating your training protocols for new staff, new hires, and making sure that you have it in a system that allows for the best outcome. You also need to have training for different levels of staff. So it's different if you hire a junior staff versus a senior staff versus even to directors and senior officers. And so it is something that you need to develop. I also did a video in relation to how to develop in-house training on my YouTube channel previously, so definitely check that out. But that's also a topic we will go into depth in the future. I have a number of topics already scoped in the membership that are going to be brought up over time, and that is going to be one of them, to help compliance professionals develop their own in-house training. And I'm really excited to offer some tools and some tricks as I go along in terms of giving you better outcome as compliance professionals. I definitely want to help in that space. Now, remember, you were documenting the things that have changed in the manual. This is where you pull that particular record out to help make sure that you streamline the training. Now, one of the, spoiler alert for if you've not seen the video in terms of developing your own in-house training, one of the tips that I had in that video that you should also consider is sitting through your own training. And you could do something like this using the technology to actually record certain trainings, so you don't have to necessarily stand in front of new hires. Have certain training materials pre-done, ready to go, dispatched. And when you have to update them, guess what? It's easier to update something where you have done it before and you have a particular recording. You could even bring in new staff to address some of these recording provisions and have that in your arsenal to deliver timely and relevant training to staff. So there is also more in relation to training that could be done. And I think that once you've trained in many jurisdictions, you also have to test training. It's important to test and record the test results to make sure that people are actually paying attention to what they're being taught. And your training should definitely go beyond just what is money laundering, what is terrorist financing. It should actually reflect the business that the firm is into and the risks that are inherent to that firm. To me, having the basic coverage of what is money laundering and what is terrorist financing is also something that really I think this should be taught in like high school or something now. And happily enough, in a lot of Caribbean countries that are active in financial services, they do have financial services in their curriculum to teach these issues. So learning about what money laundering is and anti-money laundering provisions is actually done in high schools in the Caribbean region. And it's something that I'm happy that a lot of the educators have developed in different countries. It helps to allow young people to know more about what is in a particular industry and how they can choose a career, because there are a lot of young people that are not aware of compliance as a career path in financial services. They think they might have to be an accountant or a lawyer. Nothing is stopping you from being an accountant. I used to be an accountant. It's not that bad. Lawyers are not that bad. I know some really good lawyers, and they're good people too. But even in those professions, you can pivot to become a compliance professional with great skill and expertise. But I think teaching it at a younger stage is really helpful. No questions tonight, but those are some of the things that I hope you would take away in relation to how it would be useful in the development of your compliance manual, whether it's a new firm or an existing firm. There are other things that you may want to consider. And even if it's not compliance for financial services, traditional financial services, Compliance manuals are required for nonprofit organizations. They're required for DNFBPs, so designated non-financial businesses and persons, professions. I keep getting that wrong whenever I have to do it like live, but it is a grouping of other service providers that have certain money laundering and terrorist financing risks. So include jewelers, high value goods, so even to car dealers and some others. These are some of the things that you can definitely take away to help you develop your manual. What else would I want to say in relation to developing the manual? Be focused. Make sure that you don't feel overwhelmed in relation to this. It is doable. It takes dedication, but I think it is something that once you have a nice guide that's typically provided by regulators, and if you're in a jurisdiction where your regulator has not provided a guide, there are many jurisdictions that have provided a guide. And definitely look around. I am from the British Virgin Islands, but I also look at what is done in other jurisdictions, and I speak to regulatory colleagues in other jurisdictions. And the two are not always synonymous. So I may speak to a regulator in one jurisdiction, but look at what another jurisdiction is doing and what they've published. And definitely there's a lot of content that's out there. And what I'll be doing in the membership so that you're not sifting around, because I know it can be difficult sometimes in terms of trying to find what is the high watermark for certain things. We'll be also looking at where there are some leading jurisdictions that help compliance professionals better than others, because I do think that that is actually a real thing. And again, it's in the description below. There's a lot more information. If you want to contact me or connect with me on LinkedIn, my LinkedIn profile address is below. I'm also on Twitter. Not really, I'm new to Twitter and I'm trying to navigate it still, but you can also follow me on Twitter. I have interesting views. I got onto Twitter mainly for crypto. I do invest in crypto. I have experience regulating fintechs, and I've engaged in that particular space. So it's something that I have also covered. It's on the channel and it'll be in the membership to some degree. But I am going to wrap it up here. I definitely hope you found this helpful. Do know that the membership is still open for founding members to join, and I am so looking forward. Thank you for those that have already joined. They're in the door. It will not be an open membership, so the membership will close after a particular time. And what I would want you to do is follow me on LinkedIn, because those updates are going to be there. But also follow my company, Ignis Solutions Limited, and the link is in the description below. And if it's not, I'll make sure that it is. But Ignis Solutions Limited is my company. I have a blog as well. There's a lot of free content. If you can't join the membership, don't feel pressured. But compliance is simple, said no one ever. And so what I'm going to do in that membership, we're going to make sure that we keep it interesting, and of course, make sure that you're able to get at useful content in less time than it takes you to read a compliance manual. So guys, I'm going to end it here, and thank you for those that joined me and stuck with me throughout the live. And thank you for all of you that have subscribed, and thank you for all of you that watch in the future. Reach out to me, hit that notification bell so that when I do go live, you get notification, or when I drop a video, you're definitely in the know. Make sure that you share this with your friends in the compliance industry. Fellow compliance professionals around the world are really under pressure right now. There's a lot going on. It's one of the fastest growing careers. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from each other. Definitely thumbs up. YouTube disabled the dislikes. So give me a thumbs up. It helps the algorithm. And guys, I'm going to end it here, and I'm definitely going to catch you on my next one. And I'm going to try and give a little more notice for the next live. So have a good one, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.